Okay, so we're going to continue here with Common Sense by Thomas Paine. And so we were talking about the fear related to independence. And this fear, Mr. Paine is talking about in relation to those who are fearful of independence from Great Britain. And he cites that they might be fearful because there is no plan yet laid down. Men do not see their way out. And so he gives a hint as a potential solution. He says, could the straggling thoughts of individuals be collected, they would frequently form materials for wise and able men to improve into useful matter. That is, the substrate, everything that is necessary to subdue those insecurities that come from independence from England are within our thoughts, within our minds, though scattered that they may be, if we were to collect them together. They would form materials to improve into a useful matter. And he goes on to say, let the assemblies be annual, with the president only, the representation more equal, their business wholly domestic, and subject to the authority of the Continental Congress. And so he says further that we should gather these thoughts annually from the body of men, our citizens, our compatriots, through their elected representatives. This body should meet annually with the president only, someone chosen by electors. He says the representation more equal, their business wholly domestic, unlike that of England, and subject to the authority of the Continental Congress. Let each colony be divided into 6, 8, or 10 convenient districts, each district to send a proper number of delegates to Congress, so that each colony sends at least 30. The whole number in Congress will be at least 390, each Congress to sit and to choose a president by the following method. When the delegates are met, let a colony be taken from the whole 13 colonies by lot, after which let the whole Congress choose by ballot a president from out of the delegates of that province. In the next Congress, let a colony be taken by lot from 12 only, omitting that colony from which a president was taken in the former Congress, and so proceeding on until the whole 13 shall have had their proportional or proper rotation. And in order that nothing may pass into law but what is satisfactorily just, nor less than 3/5 of the Congress to be called a majority. He that will promote discord under the government so equally formed as this would have joined Lucifer in his revolt. So here we're getting into the specifics of representative government. And he said his proposal, Mr. Paine's proposal, is to divide each colony into 6, 8, or 10 convenient districts. Each district to send a proper number of delegates to Congress. Now what that proper number is, or he gives a number, but what is proper about that number remains unclear. So that each colony sends at least 30. Now why is it at least 30? I don't know. The whole number in Congress will be at least 390. Each Congress to sit and to choose a president by the following method. So the delegates meet. Let a colony be taken from the whole 13 colonies by lot. So they draw straws, if you will. After which, let the whole Congress choose by ballot a president from out of the delegates of that province. Okay, so we have a drawing of numbers randomly by each of these 13 colonies. Now, when the lucky 13 colony, the lucky number, the lucky one of the 13 colonies, draws that number, of that body of delegates will be chosen by ballot, by vote, the president. In the next Congress, let a colony be taken by lot from 12 only. Okay, so we're omitting the one that we've already chosen, or that was already randomly chosen. Right, the president was selected from that body already, and so no more. And we go on that way through that whole rotation until the entire 13 have had their opportunity to lead. And in order that nothing may pass into law but what is satisfactorily just, he goes on to say, not less than 3/5 of the Congress can to be called a majority. So in other words, 60% is to be called a majority. So he that will promote discord under government so equally formed as this would have joined Lucifer in his revolt. So, if there are those that will choose disharmony under the government that is so equally formed as the one that we have just spoken about, then he would have joined Lucifer in his revolt, the fallen angel. To illustrate that a little bit more clearly, the fallen angel, that is, the being that, at least in part, encapsulates, embodies a divine nature, unlike man, unlike the human being, which can perceive of it, but is not in and of themselves divine. In the same way that this fallen angel exists in our minds, in our reality, from a state of absolute perfection to one of delusion and self-promotion, arrogance, and pride. So he continues, but as there is a peculiar delicacy, from whom or in what manner this business must first arise, and as it seems most agreeable and consistent that it should come from some intermediate body between the governed and governors, that is, between the Congress and the people, let a continental conference be held in the following manner, and for the following purpose. A committee of 26 members of Congress, namely 2 for each colony, 2 members from each House of Assembly, or provincial convention, and 5 representatives of the people at large, to be chosen in the capital city or town of each province. For, in behalf of the whole province, by as many qualified voters as shall think proper to attend from all parts of the province for that purpose, or, if more convenient, that the representatives may be chosen in 2 or 3 of the most populous parts thereof. In this conference, thus assembled, will be united the 2 grand principles of business, knowledge and power. The members of the Congress assemblies or conventions, by having had experience in national concerns, will be able and useful counselors, and the whole, being empowered by the people, will have a truly legal authority. So to run over this again, we have 13 colonies. We are taking 2 members of Congress, namely 2 from each colony, and we are taking 5 representatives of the people at large, and these people are going to be chosen in the capital city of the town or province, and they're going to be chosen by as many qualified voters as shall think proper to attend from all parts of the province for that purpose. That statement is a bit vague. What is a qualified voter? But he goes on to say, or if more convenient, the representatives may be chosen in 2 or 3 of the most populous parts thereof. So, in other words, I think the idea there is that if you have a higher population density, if you choose members out of that body, you're going to have a representative sample. As in part, as you have a greater degree of population density, you have a greater degree of dialogue, discussion, culture. Assembly is going to have 2 grand principles united, that is, knowledge and power. Power, in the sense of the elected members of government, of Congress, and knowledge of the people. So to continue, the conferring members being met, let their business be to frame the Continental Charter, or Charter of the United Colonies, answering to what is called the Magna Carta in England, fixing the number and manner of choosing members of Congress, and members of Assembly, with their date of sitting, and drawing a line of business and jurisdiction between them, always remembering that our strength is continental, not provincial, securing freedom and property to all men, and above all things, the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience, with such other matter as is necessary for the charter to contain. Immediately after which, the said conference to dissolve, and the bodies which shall be chosen conformable to the said charter, to be the legislatures and governors of this continent for the time being, whose peace and happiness may God preserve. Amen. So a charter is this sort of written grant by the governmental authorities. And perhaps it's not the best way to put that, because I wouldn't put it necessarily as a grant, because it's already given. It's given by the divine authority. But it is now written, just like as in England, the Magna Carta. So this lays down sort of the infrastructure of government, fixing the number and manner of choosing members of Congress and members of Assembly with their dates of sitting, and drawing the line of business and jurisdiction between them. And he says, we must always remember that our strength is continental, not provincial. That means united we have this strength, not within the multiplicity. And it's within this unity of securing freedom and property to all men and above things, the exercise of free religion, that we will be able to bind together. And he says, after they've made this, after they've put this charter together, the body will dissolve. And the bodies which shall be chosen conformable to the said charter, to be the legislators and governors of this continent for the time being, whose peace and happiness may God preserve. Amen. So here we see the development of a nation. In my mind, this is exciting. This is exciting literature. This is poetic literature, and the fact that he sort of proposes this in a form of a prayer is also very interesting. A very interesting observation. The constant reminder of the godliness of the men of the Revolutionary era. Should any body of men be hereafter delegated for this or some similar purpose, I offer them the following extracts from that wise observer on governments, Dragonetti. The science, he says, of the politician consists in fixing the true point of happiness and freedom. Those men would deserve the gratitude of ages who should discover a mode of government that contained the greatest sum of individual happiness, with the least national expense. Dragonetti on virtue and rewards. So if this science of the politician is to consist of fixing the true point of happiness and freedom, or in other words, developing the very point by which the axis of our nation spins is to be happiness and freedom, then those men deserve the gratitude of ages. Who should discover a mode of government that contained the greatest sum of individual happiness with the least national expense? So the optimal form of government. But where, say some, is the King of America? I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above, and does not make havoc of mankind like the royal brute of Britain. Yet that we may not appear to be defective even in earthly honors, let a day be solemnly set apart for proclaiming the Charter. Let it be brought forth, placed on the divine law, the Word of God. Let a crown be placed thereon, by which the world may know that so far as we approve of monarchy, that in America the law is king. For as in absolute governments the king is law, so in free countries the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. But lest any ill use should afterwards arise, let the crown of the But lest any ill use should afterwards arise, let the crown at the conclusion of the ceremony be demolished, and scattered among the people whose right it is. So we've already had much talk in this book, Common Sense, about the role, about the structure of the English monarchy, and the distinction between a free and open society and a top-down authoritarian government. And so it is certainly a poetic statement to hear that in America the law is king, and in absolute governments the king, or one man, is law. And of course, the most important bit here is that if we are to ask, where is the King of America? He says, I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above, and does not make havoc of mankind like the royal brute of Britain. And so that is to say, our king is the true king. It is the is that is, the truth of truths, the absolute love. A government of our own is our natural right, and when a man seriously reflects on the precariousness of human affairs, he will become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution of our own, in a cool, deliberate manner, while we have it in our own power, that to trust such an interesting event to time and chance. If we omit now some Massanello may hereafter arise, who, laying hold of popular disquietudes, may collect together the desperate and the disconnected, and by assuming themselves the power of government, may sweep away the liberties of the continent like a deluge. Should the government of America return again into the hands of Britain, the tottering situation of things will be a temptation for some desperate adventurer to try his fortune. And in such a case, what relief can Britain give? Ere she could hear the news, the fatal business might be done, and ourselves suffering like the wretched Britons under the oppression of the conqueror. Ye that oppose independence now, ye know not what ye do. Ye are opening the door to eternal tyranny by keeping vacant the seat of government. So let's dissect this paragraph. A government of our own is our natural right. And when a man seriously reflects on the instability of human affairs, he will become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution of our own. So let's dissect this paragraph. A government of our own is our natural right. And when a man seriously reflects on the precariousness of human affairs, or in other words, he reflects on the potential instability of human affairs, he will become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution. And a constitution is a document that has the fundamental principles on which a nation is founded, much like in the previous quote that Mr. Paine uses by Dragonetti, saying that the science of the politician consists in fixing the true points of happiness and freedom, that is, these 2 points, happiness and freedom, as the axis by which everything revolves around, the political choices by these politicians. It revolves around this axis, whereas a constitution is even more substantial. This document, the entire society, the nation, revolves around this bit of information. Form a constitution of our own in a cool, deliberate manner, while we have it in our power, than to trust such an interesting event to time and chance. If we omit now some Massanello, I'm just going to leave it at that, may hereafter arise. So this figure was a leader of a revolt in 1647 against the rule of Habsburg Spain in the Kingdom of Naples. So Mr. Paine is saying here, if we stop, some figure, some leader of a revolt may hereafter arise, who, laying hold of popular disquietudes, or in other words, a state of anxiety or uneasiness, may collect together the desperate and the disconnected by assuming to themselves the power of government. So in other words, they can usurp it for themselves, and it may sweep away the liberties of the continent like a deluge, like a flood. Should the government of America return again into the hands of Britain, the tottering situation of things will be a temptation for some desperate adventurer to try his fortune. And in such a case, what relief can Britain give? In other words, if Britain takes over, our desperation in such a state would have this revolt figure pop up. And in such a case, what can Britain do against some desperate, that's the key word there, desperate adventurer to try his fortune? What can they do? Here, she could hear the news, the fatal business might be done, and ourselves suffering like the wretched Britons under the oppression of the conqueror. You that oppose independence now, you know not what you do. You are opening the door to eternal tyranny by keeping vacant the seat of government. The strong words there. There are thousands and tens of thousands who would think that it glorious to expel from the continent that barbarous and hellish power which has stirred up the Indians and the Negroes to destroy us. In other words, Great Britain is using tactics to stir up the Indians and the black people against the colonists. The cruelty has a double guilt. It is dealing brutally by us and treacherously by them. To talk of friendship with those in whom our reason forbids us to have faith, and our affections, wounded through 1,000 pores, instruct us to detest, is madness and folly. Every day wears out a little remains of kindred between us and them. And can there be any reason to hope that as the relationship expires the affection will increase, or that we shall agree better when we have 10 times more and greater concerns to quarrel over than ever? You that tell us of harmony and reconciliation, can you restore to us the time that is past? Can you give to prostitution its former innocence? Neither can you reconcile Britain and neither can you reconcile Britain and America. The last cord is now broken. The people of England are presenting addresses against us. There are injuries which nature cannot forgive. She would cease to be nature if she did. As well can the lover forgive the ravisher of his mistress, as the continent forgive the murderers of Britain. The Almighty has implanted in us these unextinguishable feelings for good and wise purposes. They are the guardians of His image and are in our hearts. They distinguish us from the herd of common animals. The social compact would dissolve, and justice would be extirpated from the earth, or have only casual existence, where we callous to the touches of affection. The robber and the murderer would often escape unpunished, did not the injuries which our tempers sustain provoke us to injustice. Let me reread that. The robber and the murderer would often escape unpunished, did not the injuries which our tempers sustain provoke us into justice. O you that love mankind, you that dare oppose, not only the tyranny, but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom has been hunted around the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England has given her a warning to depart. Oh, receive the fugitive, and prepare in time an asylum for mankind. So, this is really beautiful language. So he begins the second to last paragraph by saying, you tell us of harmony and reconciliation, but can you wind the clock back? Can you take back all the wrongs that have been done to us? Can you give to prostitution its former innocence? Obviously, there's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. Neither can you reconcile Britain and America. The cord's broken. The people of England are presenting addresses against us. As well can the lover forgive the ravisher of his mistress, as the continent forgive the murderers of Britain. The Almighty has implanted in us the unextinguishable feelings for good and wise purposes. They are the guardians of His image in our hearts. That's a profound statement. The Almighty has implanted in us these unextinguishable feelings for good and wise purposes. And it's these feelings, this proclivity to the wise and the good, it is these very things that are the guardians of His image in our hearts. through these things that we are able to even perceive of the divine nature. They distinguish us from the herd of common animals. The social compact would dissolve and justice would be extirpated from earth, or have only a casual existence, were we callous to the touches of affection. Another beautiful statement. He says the very binding force, this social compact that brings humanity together, would dissolve, or at the very least, have only a casual existence, were we callous to the touches of affection. That is, in other words, the touches of affection are the very thing that strengthens our social compact. The robber and the murderer would often escape unpunished, did not the injuries which our tempers sustain provoke us into justice. Our understanding of right and wrong, the consequences of wrong, the consequences of the disturbing of that social compact, and the removal of that affection, we are provoked into justice. O you that love mankind, you that dare oppose not only tyranny, but the tyrant, stand forth, stand tall. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom has been hunted around the globe. And I can confidently say, it was then, it was before then, it will continue in this pattern, this cycle. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom has been hunted around the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Freedom. Europe regards her like a stranger. Freedom. And England has given her a warning to depart. Freedom. Oh, receive the fugitive, and prepare in time an asylum for mankind. Okay, so we're going to continue talking here about Thomas Paine's Common Sense. The title of this next section is Of the Present Ability of America, with some wise miscellaneous reflections. Now, I give reflections on what I read. I'm not sure I would call them wise. Perhaps a bit of a hubristic statement here by Mr. Payne, but perhaps not. Perhaps there is some real wisdom here. Nonetheless, I'm very interested to see what he has to say. I have never met with a man, either in England or America, who has not confessed his opinion that a separation between the countries would take place one time or another. And there is no instance in which we have shown less judgment than endeavoring to describe what we call the ripeness or fitness of the continent for independence. As all men allow the measure, and vary only in their opinion of time, let us, in order to remove mistakes, take a general survey of things, and endeavor, if possible, to find out the very time. But we need not go far. The inquiry ceases at once, for the time has found us. The general concurrence, the glorious union of all things proves the fact. So, to continue with my painstaking analysis of every paragraph and every line, he says, I have never met with a man, either in England or in America, who has not confessed his opinion that the separation between countries would take place one time or other. In other words, there's this general culture in which both Englishmen and Americans sort of understood that this was probably something that was going to happen eventually. And that there is no instance in which we have shown less judgment. Right, so I think this is implying here that it was second nature. I mean, we couldn't have perseverated on it more. We couldn't. It's a sort of like waking up in the morning and having the conscious mind be at the doorstep. It just is. That in endeavoring to describe what we call the ripeness or fitness of the continent for independence, right, it's just sort of assumed that this place is abundant, this continent has everything that we need here for this people to flourish and survive, independent of England. As all men allow the measure, and vary only in their opinion of the time, let us, in order to remove mistakes, take a general survey of things, and endeavor, if possible, to find out the very time. In other words, when will it be that we find the time of this separation, of this independence, of the continent, of America? And he says, we don't have to go far. The inquiry ceases at once, for the time has found us. It is now. The general concurrence, the glorious union of all things, proves the fact. It is not in numbers, but in unity that our strength lies. So, an interesting statement there. It's not in numbers, but in unity, as if to imply that if there was no unity, regardless of the numbers, we would have no strength. Yet our present numbers are sufficient to repel the force of all the world. The continent has, at this time, the largest body of armed and disciplined men of any power under heaven, and is just arrived at the pitch of our strength, at the pitch of strength, in which no single colony is able to support itself, and the whole, when united, can accomplish the matter, and either more or less than this might be fatal in its effects. Our land force is already sufficient, and as to naval affairs, we cannot be insensible that Britain would never suffer an American man of war to be built while the continent remained in her hands. Wherefore, we should be no forwarder an 100 years hence in that branch than we are now. But the truth is, we should be less so, because the timber of the country is every day diminishing, and that which will remain at last will be far off or difficult to procure. So of course he's saying here that individually the colonies, they won't survive, but united they have the strength. They have just arrived at that pitch which they can accomplish the matter, and either more or less might be fatal in its effects. Now he says, our land force is already sufficient, and as to its naval affairs, we cannot be insensible that Britain would never suffer an American man of war to be built while the continent remained in her hands. Wherefore, we should be no forwarder an 100 years hence in that branch that we are now. In other words, because England would not suffer America to build a man of war while the continent remains in her grasp, we should be no forwarder. We should be nowhere near in the future, 100 years from now, in that branch than we are now. But the truth is, we should less be so. We should be even farther back, because the resources that we are utilizing are diminishing. Were the continent crowded with inhabitants, our sufferings under the present circumstances would be intolerable. The more seaport towns we had, the more should we have both to defend and to lose. Our present numbers are so happily proportioned to our wants that no man need be idle. The diminution of trade affords an army, and the necessities of an army create a new trade. Debts we have none, and whatever we may contract on this account will serve as a glorious memento of our virtue. Can we but leave posterity with a settled form of government, an independent constitution of its own, the purchase at any price will be cheap. But to expend millions for the sake of getting a few vile acts repealed, and routing the present ministry only, is unworthy of change, and is using posterity with the utmost cruelty, because it is leaving them the great work to do so, and a debt upon their backs, from which derive no advantage. Such a thought is unworthy a man of honor, and is the true characteristic of a narrow heart and a peddling politician. I'm reminded of the modern age, and the debts that we now have, the debts that we've inherited, and the debts that we continue to pass on to our posterity. And yet, nowhere is seen language like this. So he's saying, if this place was more habited, if we had a greater degree of infrastructure, if our institutions were more firmly established, the sufferings under the present circumstance would be intolerable. There's more to lose. numbers are so happily proportioned to our wants that no man be idle. Everybody has something to do. It's an interesting sort of thing to reflect on. I can't tell the effect which the reflection, the academic reflection, upon the effects of corporate institutions and their role in the life of man has had on the past 200 years. Post-industrial revolution, we've seen massive corporations arise, and man's relationship to them has shifted as the life of the corporation has shifted and grown. And I can't help but think about this sentence. Our present numbers are so happily proportioned to our wants that no man need be idle. I can't help but think about this statement, happily proportioned. And I can't also help but to think that I'm not entirely confident that today we have a happily proportioned economy, in the sense that our numbers are not in proportion to our wants. Perhaps our wants are in some sense sufficient to our number, but our wants are supplied by such an insufficient number due to the efficient nature of the supply, of the corporate machine, of our industrial manufacturing, that what leaves the development and the distribution of materials to man? What job is he left to do, if not one that is beneath a liberated mind or a liberated soul, a free person? The diminution of trade affords an army, and the necessities of an army create a new trade. So in other words, the reduction of trade affords an army. It's an interesting statement. To reduce one's trade is to reduce one's income. And to reduce one's income, what does this mean? To reduce one's standard of living, to reduce their purpose, perhaps. But it affords this deprivation, this decrease in wealth, affords an army. And the necessities of an army create a new trade. This to me sounds like a dangerous statement. Of course, one that is only justified in extreme circumstances. Perhaps like in this case, in the case of the American Revolution, fighting for freedom and independence. And of course he makes a good point. We should not expend millions to repeal some unjust acts, or to eject some corrupt ministers. Because this is only going to leave our posterity in debt. It's this type of forward thinking that led to the success of this country and the success of its future generations. We see very little of this now, today. The debt we may contract does not deserve our regard. If the work be but accomplished, in other words, if we gain our liberty. And in our modern day, what does our debt accomplish? It accomplishes our material well-being, not the independence, not the freedom of man, not the freedom of his soul or his mind, the unlocking of his shackles. It is the opposite. It's the reshackling to the material reality and the enslavement of our posterity. No nation ought to be without debt. A national debt is a national bond. And when it bears no interest, is in no case a grievance. Britain is oppressed with a debt of upwards 140 million sterling, for which she pays upward of 4 million in interest. And as a compensation for her debt, she has a large navy. America is without debt and without a navy. Yet for the 20th part of the English national debt, could a navy as large again? Could have a navy as large again? The Navy of England is not worth, at this time, more than 3 millions and a half sterling. Again, dangerous territory here, in my opinion, by Mr. Payne. He says a national debt is a national bond. Now the key thing here is that when it bears no interest, is in no case a grievance. But if it did have an interest attached to it, then it would be something to grieve. And then he gives an example of the British Navy. Britain itself is oppressed with a debt of upwards of 140 millions of sterling, for which he pays upward of 4 million in interest. And as a compensation for her debt, she has a large navy. In other words, they had to go into debt for their navy, for which they now pay interest. And interest, in my opinion, is just a tax on future generations. Or a tax on the future, let's say. Because when the time of your payment comes in the future, since you cannot pay it now, which is the whole reason that you take out debt, then added monies will be placed on top of that for the justification of the person giving the debt. And of course, this is an obvious sacrifice of the future to the present. However, without that debt, or without that interest, you still have the debt. There is still sacrifice to the future. But it is not insulted. There's no continual money placed on top of it, in which someone else to profit from your desperation, perhaps, at least in this case. America is without a debt and without a navy. Yet for the 20th part of the English national debt, we could have a navy as large again. So I can't help but think that this sort of contradicts his original statement, that there's nothing wrong with national debt, and the statement that no nation ought to be without a debt. Because the only reason that America can afford a navy at 20th, the part of the English national debt, is because they don't have any debt. They don't have any interest payments that are sucking up their funds. The following calculations are given as a proof that the above estimation of the Navy is just one. So he goes into some numbers here. And a quote from Entick's Naval History, intro, page 56. The charge of building a ship of each rate and furnishing her with masts, yards, sails, and rigging, together with a proportion of 8 months, boatswain, and carpenters, sea stores, as calculated by Mr. Burchett, Secretary of the Navy, is as follows. And so for a ship of 100 guns, this is 35,500 pounds. And for a ship of 20 guns, it is about 3,700 pounds. And each ship is broken down into the number of guns minus 10. I've just given you the most and the least for brevity. And from here, it is easy to sum up the value, or cost rather, of the whole British Navy, which in the year 1757, when it was at its greatest glory, consisted of the following ships and guns. So they had 6 ships that had 100 guns, 12 ships with 90 guns, 12 ships with 80 guns, 43 ships with 70 guns, 35 ships with 60 guns, 40 ships with 50 guns, 45 ships with 40 guns, and 58 ships with 20 guns. They had 85 sloops, bombs, and fire ships, one with another. And so in total, this cost them about 3.5 million pounds. No country on the globe is so happily situated, or so internally capable of raising a fleet as America. Tar, timber, iron, cordage are her natural produce. We need go abroad for nothing, whereas the Dutch, who make large profits by hiring out their ships of war to the Spaniards and Portuguese, are obliged to import most of the materials they use. We ought to view the building of a fleet as an article of commerce. It being the natural manufacture of this country, it is the best money we can lay out. A navy, when finished, is more than it costs. And it is that nice point in national policy, in which commerce and protection are united. Let us build. If we want them not, we can sell, and by that means replace our paper currency with ready gold and silver. So perhaps a correction here is warranted on the previous page. When Thomas Paine was talking about when we should be no forwarder 100 years from now in that branch than we are now. So the truth is we should be less so, because the timber of the country is every day diminishing. I think here he's referring to England. And so now he's saying, we need to go abroad for nothing. We have all the raw materials here to build our navy. We're not like the Dutch, who have to rent out their ship to the Spaniards. And the Portuguese. And they also import their materials. We ought to view the building of a fleet as an article of commerce. And why is that? It being the natural manufacture of this country. It is the best money we can lay out. Again, why is that? A navy, when finished, is worth more than it cost. Okay? Why is that? And it is a nice point in national policy in which commerce and protection are united. Okay? I can understand that reasoning. Because if it is unprotected, it is exposed to pirates, you can lose a lot of money, a lot of commerce in that trade. A trade that is exposed to the dangers. Let us build. If we want them not, then we can sell them. By what means replace our paper currency with the ready gold and silver. In other words, tangible items. Items of true value. In point of manning a fleet, people in general run into great errors. It is not necessary that 1/4 part should be sailors. The privateer, terrible Captain Death, stood the hottest engagement of any ship last war. Yet had not 20 sailors on board, though her complement of men was upwards of 200. A few able and social sailors will soon instruct a sufficient number of active landsmen in the common work of a ship. Wherefore, we never can be more capable to begin on maritime matters than now, while our timber is still standing, our fisheries blocked up, and our sailors and shipwrights out of employ. And so here now, it comes into view that when Thomas Paine said the bit about not having trade, then we are able to afford an army. Well, here it is, and our sailors and shipwrights out of employ can now be employed in the service of their country. Wherefore, we never can be more capable to begin on. Wherefore, okay, let me start over. Men of war of 70 and 80 guns were built 40 years ago in New England. Why not the same now? Shipbuilding is America's greatest pride, and in which she will, in time, excel the whole world. The great empires of the East are mostly inland, and consequently excluded from the possibility of rivaling her. Africa is in a state of barbarism, and no power in Europe has either such an extent of coast or such an internal supply of materials. Where nature has given the one, she has withheld the other. To America only has she been liberal of both. The vast empire held the other. Okay, I've already read that. The vast empire of Russia is almost shut off from the sea. Wherefore, her boundless forest, her tar, iron, and cordage are only articles of commerce. In point of safety, how would we be without a fleet? We are not the little people now which we were 60 years ago. At that time we might have trusted our property in the streets, or fields rather, and slept securely without locks or bolts to our doors and windows. The case is now altered, and our methods of defense ought to improve with our increase of property. A common pirate, 12 months ago, might have come up the Delaware, and laid the city of Philadelphia under instant contribution for what sum he pleased, and the same might have happened to other places. Nay, any daring fellow, in a brig of 14 or 16 guns, might have robbed the whole continent, and carried off 500,000 of money. These are circumstances which demand our attention, and point out the necessity of naval protection. And so we're also seeing here an argument for a socialized defense. Obviously, national defense is nothing new to that era, but this is sort of a police force. Because if we see a privateer coming up the Delaware, this is an internal affair. This is a domestic affair. This is a police responsibility, a policing responsibility. Some perhaps will say that after we have made up with Britain, she will protect us. Can they be so unwise as to mean that she will keep a navy in our harbors for that purpose? Common sense will tell us that the power which has endeavored to subdue us is of all others the most improper to defend us. Conquest may be effected under the pretense of friendship. Ourselves, after a long and brave resistance, be at last cheated into slavery. And if her ships are not to be admitted into our harbors, I would ask, how is she to protect us? A navy 300 or 400 miles off can be of little use, and on sudden emergencies, none at all. Wherefore, if we must hereafter protect ourselves, why not do it for ourselves? Why not do it for another? The English list of ships of war is long and formidable, but not a tenth part of them are at any one time fit for service. Numbers of them are not in being, yet their names are pompously continued in the list, if only a plank be left of the ship. And not a fifth part of such as are fit for service can be spared on any one station at one time. The East and the West Indies, Mediterranean, Africa, and other parts of the world over which Britain extends her claim make large demands upon her navy. In other words, she has to police. England, Britain, at this time, much like America is today, was the policeman of the world. From a mixture of prejudice and inattention, we have contracted a false notion of respecting the Navy of England, and have talked as if we should have the whole of it to encounter at once, and for that reason suppose that we must have one as large, which not being incessantly practical, has been made use of by a set distinguished Tories to discourage our beginning thereon. So let me reread that sentence. From a mixture of prejudice and inattention, we have contracted a false notion respecting the Navy of England, and have talked as if we should have the whole of it to encounter at once, and, for that reason, suppose that we must have one as large, which, not being instantly practicable, has been made use of a set of disguised Tories to discourage our beginning thereon. Nothing can be further from the truth than this, for if America had only a 20th part of the naval force of Britain, she would be by far an overmatch for her, because employed on our own coast, where she would, in the long run, have 2 to 1 the advantage of those who had 3,000 or 4,000 miles to sail over before they could attack us, and the same distance to return in order to refit and recruit. And although Britain, by her fleet, has a check over our trade to Europe, we have as large a one over her trade to the West Indies, which by lying in the neighborhood of the continent is entirely at its mercy. So a bit of a strategic illustration here. So England, the numbers aren't entirely accurate. Their navy is stretched thin because of the number of territories that they have to police. America has none of these. Although England can check their trade to Europe, America can check their trade from the West Indies. Some method might be fallen on to keep up a naval force in a time of peace, if we should not judge it necessary to support a constant navy. If premiums were to be given to merchants to build and employ in their service ships mounted with 20, 30, 40, or 50 guns, the premium to be in proportion to the loss of bulk to the merchants. 50 or 60 of those ships, with a few guarded ships on constant duty, would keep up a sufficient navy, and that without burdening ourselves with the evil so loudly complained of in England, of suffering their fleet in time of peace to lie rotting in the docks, to unite the sinews of commerce and defense, is a sound policy. For when our strength and our riches play into each other's hand, we need fear no external enemy. Of course, there are echoes here to the American experience of how large our military apparatus is that largely sits wasting away, and it's fueled off the backs of normal Americans, working Americans. How unfortunate our present circumstance is. On the one hand, because of the size and the extent of our social responsibility, our perceived social responsibility, that is, to maintain a military of such a size, but also at the complexity that necessitates such a military to be institutionalized. Because, of course, these days we can't imagine, in this age of globalization, of mounting ships with guns, merchant ships with guns. I suppose it would make sense to have a few ships guard those merchant ships to keep them safe. But it is just an interesting contrast between this era and the previous.